Hi everyone. So last time what we discussed is we tried to get a handle on what the main project of the prolegomena to any future metaphysics is. And there basically the question was, how are synthetic a priori judgments possible? And Kant asked this question because Kant wants to say that those sorts of questions, synthetic a priori questions, are the sorts of questions that metaphysics asks, right? Because metaphysics tries to amplify our knowledge, so it's synthetic, and it tries to give universal and necessary principles, and so they're a priori. So the question is, the transcendental question for Kant is just asking, well, how are synthetic a priori judgments possible? And this is exactly what Kant calls transcendental philosophy. He wants to investigate, the conditions under which we could potentially be right or wrong about metaphysical judgments, or go about investigating them, right? And it's very important because really a lot of the philosophy after Kant, after the modern period, sort of defines itself through this transcendental break. A lot of philosophers will sort of take up Kant in various ways and try to say, okay, Kant was right that, what we need to do in order to resolve the divide between rationalism and empiricism is we need a kind of transcendental philosophy. And then, normally they'll say, but Kant's got it wrong in such and such details. And so, but in general, for the most part, you don't really see the sort of philosophizing that you encounter really in, Spinoza really happening that much more after Kant. It's kind of seen like, okay, well, Kant really opens this question: how is metaphysics possible? And so it's no longer, viable for people to just sort of spit out, proofs of the existence of God. Before we start doing that kind of stuff, we really need to ask the question of, is it even possible for us to, be able to prove the existence of God using concepts, right? This is something that a lot of the other early modern tradition didn't really investigate, right? The rationalists just more or less took it for granted that metaphysics in many ways resembles or uses the language of mathematics, and so, must resemble mathematics in the sense of being a priori principles, right? And you can see this especially in Leibniz, right? For Leibniz, the universe is completely rationally structured, completely mathematically structured, right? And God's operation, God is basically like the universal calculator, right? That God just acts on the most rational means that you could possibly have, and that in part that's determined mathematically, right? And so, for the rationalists like Leibniz, mathematics is the highest form of knowledge because it's universal and necessary. And it seems that metaphysics must, in many respects, resemble mathematics if it wants to, get at the same kind of truth. And so while the empiricists, to some extent, wanted to interrogate the analogy between metaphysics and mathematical knowledge, and we saw that to some extent in Hume, right? Really, it had sort of left untouched the relationship between mathematics and metaphysics, because Hume's way of discussing mathematics made it seem almost as if all mathematical propositions were just analytic. They were just relations between our ideas. They were a formal system that we made up that may or may not have any sort of adequacy to the existing world. Now, for Kant, that's a huge problem because if you look at the success of physics and natural science, right? For us, we can look at our phone, right? Like, why is it that we can consistently program a phone or a computer? Why is it that, reality as we know it is mathematically structured, right? And it seems like that makes it different than other formal systems that we make up, right? Math has such an amazing efficacy in the actual world for conducting scientific investigation, but also for basically any skill where you need to create things, right? Like my wife crochets. Crochet requires mathematics. It's maybe a relatively basic form, right? But you need to explain the salience of this system. If you want to say mathematics is just a formal system, it's like any other formal system, then you have to answer the question, okay, well, why does this one work? Right? And Leibniz's answer to that is, well, God is good. God is good, and so God would order the universe in a mathematically structurable way, right? And so that's a traditional sort of like metaphysical take on mathematics, right? That mathematics works because it reflects the ultimate nature of reality. And, you might also call this Platonic, Leibniz makes a lot of appeals to Plato throughout his investigations. So basically, what Kant wants to say is that neither the rationalists nor the empiricists have really sufficiently investigated the nature of mathematics. Why is it that mathematical reasoning really works? Why does it apply to the world, right? And the sort of answers that they gave, right, for Leibniz, they reflects the ultimate nature of reality, and for Hume, that they're entirely analytic. These are both answers that Kant is going to reject, importantly. Okay, so this is just to say that, part of the way that Kant's project and the idea of transcendental philosophy, which is really just taking kind of a methodological approach to the problems that we've been examining. Instead of like just trying to go out and prove the existence of God, you first ask the question, how would such a proof proceed? What is the basis for my belief that I, have the ability to prove the existence of God, right? How would I go about doing that? What would count as an objection, right? Or a really powerful objection? To some extent, the early moderns were concerned with this question, but they didn't ask it in a rigorous methodological form. At least that's what Kant claims. So we've talked a little bit about mathematics, and we're going to talk more about mathematics in this video, but I also want to mention that Kant also talks about natural science. And now it might seem a little strange that Kant says that certain elements of natural science are a priori, but what he has in mind are like Newtonian laws, right? That every action has an equal and opposite reaction, right? That is something that we know universally and necessarily, right? It's not the sort of thing that we know simply through experiments, right? It's something that is necessary for the construction of our experiments, right? And, again, keep in mind the specific time period that we're talking about here, right? We're talking about the 1780s, 1790s, right? And so just to give you a little bit of background, remember, it's only been a couple of 100 years since Copernicus, right? And since then, physics has made great strides in part through Newtonian laws, right? And Newton thought of his laws as basically rules that God made when constructing the universe. And so he thought of it in a kind of similar to Leibnizian way, right? And so those are universal and they're necessary because they're conditions for the physical world, right? They're necessary principles. And so Kant wants to say, well, our advances in physics, right, and in natural science, they're made possible by the fact that we've discovered pure a priori principles that we can know, and these are going to be related to the concepts of like inertia, and force and magnitude and so on, right? Okay, so I think that's good for an introduction. This is why Kant compares metaphysics to these two domains, mathematics and natural science. So today we're going to get more into the weeds on Kant's specific answer. So first question, how is pure mathematics possible? Kant's answer is a process known as construction. Okay, so this is a very complex idea, but it is one that I think is understandable, ultimately. We discussed in the last video that Kant considers space and time forms of our sensibility. In other words, we can know a priori that any object that we encounter in experience will be in space and it will be in time, right? So, take any book, right? Any book will have a shape, right? Why does it have a shape? Well, because it's an object that, exists in space, right? I can know this a priori because it applies to any and all objective experience that I have, so it's universal, it applies to all of them, and it's necessary. There will be no exceptions. Everything that I experience will be in space and in time. Now, then Kant begins to say something that's rather complex. So, first part is a justification for Kant's transcendental idealism. And again, it's important to distinguish between transcendental and transcendent. Transcendent means you're going beyond the boundaries. Transcendental means you're staying within the boundaries. So transcendent uses of reason are always going to be like bad cases, right? Whereas transcendental idealism is how Kant describes his own position, right? So Kant says if space and time are forms of our sensibility, and this is why they apply to objects that we sense and experience, right? Like the book or the aloe vera or, whatever else. But they don't apply to concepts, right? It doesn't apply to the number 3, right? It doesn't apply to the concept of cat, right? It's not about the concept. It's about things that I can intuit. It's about things that I can encounter, right, in the world. So what that sort of leads us to is the following idea. Okay, so if space and time are the form of your intuition, then you also have the ability to manipulate this material using your imagination, right? So I've got 2 books, right? I always do these dumb examples. I hope that they're okay, I always just want to make it more basic. I hope that doesn't get very old. But in any case, so I have 2 books, right? I can imaginatively iterate a 3rd book so that instead of 2, there are 3, right? What Kant is trying to say is that because space and time are forms of your intuition, you can also make them formal intuitions. I'll write that down here. Which means that, say, whenever I see, however, big this book is, I don't know, 12 inches or something like that, right? Then I can abstract from the qualities of the book, right, and focus just on the space it takes up, right? And so whenever I focus on just the space it takes up, Kant says I have a pure or formal intuition. Why is it pure? Well, because it doesn't contain any material that I've received, right? It's a way that I've sort of like sliced up time in my own experience, right? So it's pure because it doesn't have any element that comes from the outside world, right? And it's formal, it's a formal intuition since I'm paying attention only to the form in which I intuit things, right? And so through pure formal intuitions, I have the ability to see, or, or to experience, to intuit 12 inches, right? Or I have the ability to intuit, two objects, one object then another object, or one experience and then another experience, right? So Kant's going to say, well, you know how pure mathematics is possible is construction, right? You're constructing something that you can intuit. And it's pure because it's something that you entirely are creating, right? And say I can, create imaginative figures in my head. I can start drawing triangles, right? All this kind of stuff, right? I can manipulate space in a certain way, right? And then in manipulating space in that way, I can come to certain conclusions, right? I can be like, okay, here are the angles, this triangle, I can say there are three sides, there are 3 points, I can start doing all of that work. And this produces universal and necessary knowledge because it's going to be true for anyone, right? Everyone has space and time as the forms of their intuition. So they're going to experience the same thing that I experience, right? And it's synthetic because it tells me something about space and time. Kant's idea is that arithmetic is possible because we can count time increments, and that geometry is possible because we can manipulate and construct figures in space. Just as I constructed this triangle, I can also construct a circle, right? And I can engage in all sorts of geometric, investigations on the spaces. So what Kant says about pure mathematics, the reason why pure mathematics works is because pure mathematics has an intuition that it's working with, right? Even though it's one that you construct, right? It's one that you can manipulate, right? It's one that you can, do all sorts of stuff with, whenever you are doing geometry, right? Nonetheless, pure mathematics is possible exactly because it does not transcend the bounds of our possible intuition, right? So this is Kant's argument. This is why this use of reason is okay, is because it's conditioned ultimately by the forms of our intuition. And that's why mathematics is possible. Now for metaphysics, right, we don't have any ability to sort of like engage in a constructive project in the same way, right? What's essential to Kant's account here is that space and time are sort of like forms or figures or something to that effect that I can manipulate at will, and we can kind of see that whenever you start drawing geometric figures on a board, right? There's no equivalent for doing that for metaphysics. And why? It's because space and time are intuitions. They're, forms in which objects are given to us. But metaphysics doesn't use intuitions, it uses concepts, right? So this is the fundamental distinction between that Kant draws between metaphysics and mathematics. Mathematics always has a correlate, or at least a possible correlate, to our experience. We can know in some way how to apply it or how to construct the geometric or arithmetic figure that we're supposed to be examining, right? So, boom, Kant thinks he's answered that question. How is pure mathematics possible? Ultimately, his answer is construction, aka using the form of sensibility. Hence, I've written sensibility in the same color as this first question to indicate a relationship between them, right? Pure mathematics is possible because of the form of our sensibility. The fact that we exist in space and in time. Again, very, very important to highlight the difference between this view and a Leibnizian view, right? For Kant, mathematics is something that we can do because we're human, right? Because we have a form of sensibility, right? Whereas for Leibniz, sensibility is just a confused version of the understanding, right? And so for Leibniz, our ability to do mathematics is not at all tied to the fact that we're human, right? And he would find that bizarre, right? Like he's sort of in this Platonic tradition where mathematics is an indication of the divine, right? It's an indication that you're kind of close to God, that you're discovering the nature of ultimate reality. But Kant says, no, you're not discovering the nature of ultimate reality. You're discovering the nature of how you receive impressions, which is in space and in time. And that space and time is mathematically structured. Okay, next question. How is pure natural science possible? Answer the categories. Okay, so we've spent all of our time talking about the form of sensibility, the form by which we receive things, right? Next, we have to talk about the understanding, or the faculty of judgments, or concepts. Here, what Kant says is that, a concept is a rule, right? So a cat is, a mammal that has certain features, blah, 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 and you can list this out, and then you give a definition of a cat, right? That's how it works. Then you have a rule that you can go through and apply in your experience. You can ask of all the things in your life, like, is this a cat? And then you go through the rule, you check it, you say yes or no, right? So that's how Kant understands how concepts work, is that concepts are rules for understanding our experience. Now, some of these rules Kant thinks are pure, right? Here we're back to this idea of purity. In other words, if my application of the use of the concept cat depends in part on the thing that I receive, right? So like, I have a rule, cat, it's four-legged mammal, blah, 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 run into book, that's not a mammal, right? Then I know it's not a cat, right? But this is a kind of empirical knowledge because it depends on the thing that I'm sensing, right? But Kant has this idea that there are pure concepts of the understanding, which are basically concepts that we have to use in order to understand anything at all, right? What's one example? Okay, one example, quantity, right? So for any concept, you can say, or you can ask the question, how many, right? Are you referring to one thing? Are you referring to many things, right? Without an answer to this question, right, you don't have like a full concept, right? And, implicitly, whenever I ran through the previous operation where I was checking things in my experience to see if they were cats, right, I'd count things as one, right? I'd say this book is one thing, not a cat. This other book is one thing, not a cat, right? And so I had to apply more concepts than cat or book in order to make sense of that experience, in order to interpret it, right? And ultimately, I needed quantity as one of them. It exhibited a certain amount of that thing, right? Now, Kant gives an entire list of categories because he thinks that these categories are involved in any determinate use of our concepts whatsoever. And those categories, you don't need to memorize them, it's not important for what we're doing, but those categories fall under 4 general headings, which are quantity, quality, relation, and modality. Quantity is like how many things there are. Quality is like how is it, right? Relation, how does this event fit into the other events in the world, right? And then modality, is it necessary? Is it possible? Is it actual, right? What is the status of this sort of claim, right? Whenever I see, and I make the judgment this is not a cat, I make that judgment and I feel pretty certain that this is not actually a cat, right? And so, these general headings, Kant thinks, every use of our concepts implies one of them, right? This is a very hard to understand idea, but basically what Kant is saying is that to make sense out of the world, right, the cacophony of things that we experience, we have to apply some basic kinds of unity to it in order for it to be understandable to us, right? And these basic forms of unity don't come from the world, they come from us. They are ways that we have to think in order to make the world recognizable and understandable. So this is why they are pure concepts of the understanding, is that there's no empirical mixture. These are not concepts that I learned by going out into the world and experiencing them. They are concepts actually that I need in order for the world to make any sense at all, right? And importantly included in this list, under the relation heading, is causality, right? Kant says that, like, if you just, like, were sort of, like, dropped into the world and you had no concept of causal relationships, then you would have no way of ordering your experiences. Experience wouldn't even be possible. It'd just be a blind, confused mess, right? If you didn't have the ability to say that one object can exert a causal force on another, right, then you can't do physics. You can't really do any sort of investigation into the world that involves a sort of that involves interrogating causal relations. So Kant asks, how is pure natural science possible? Ultimately, the answer is the categories. Kant says that the pure concepts of the understanding, which is the same thing as the categories is what makes science possible. Well, why is that the case? Well, because you need a basic kind of unity to your experience in order to make experiments possible, right? It's like if you didn't believe that things in the world, objects as you experience them, that quantitative categories apply to them, right? Or you didn't believe that mathematics, the quantitative categories applied to them, or that they entered into causal relations with one another at all, right? Then you actually couldn't conduct any sort of experiments. And so the pure concepts of the understanding are almost like assumptions that we have to make as human beings for experience to be coherent, right? For us to be able to order it in any way that makes sense. Now, this is why I've written this quote here, because this is Kant's kind of most striking formulation of this idea. It comes from section 36. He says, even though it sounds strange at first, so he's recognizing it, right? it is nonetheless certain that the understanding does not draw its a priori laws from nature, but prescribes them to it. In other words, I don't learn about causality by simply examining nature. Instead, causality is a concept or a category that I have to apply to nature in order to make sense of it, right? And this is Kant's idea, and this is why Kant thinks that he's carried out a Copernican revolution in philosophy, is because he's starting to ask these questions about space and time and the categories. He says, what if these weren't features or objects of things how they are in themselves, but these were instead ways that I made the world intelligible to me, right? In the same way that we no longer think that, with Copernicus, that the stars are, centering the Earth, right? We instead construct a more complex model where we're all orbiting the sun, right? Here's Kant's Copernican revolution in philosophy. It's that objects have certain features not because they belong to the way that things are in themselves, but because these concepts or intuitions are necessary for me to apply in order to make my experience intelligible and coherent. That's Kant's Copernican revolution. That's his big idea. That's why, the categories in space and time, they have a transcendental use whenever they apply to possible experience, which means that they're used correctly, right? But that there's an inevitable tendency towards a transcendent use, where we not only think of them as belonging to things as they appear to us, but belong to objects as they exist in themselves, right? So space and time and the categories, those can only rightfully be said to apply to our experiences, to the way that things appear to us, right? They appear to be ordered spatiotemporally as well as by the categories. And that's Kant's big idea. It's motivating a lot of this research. So now the third question is easy for us to answer. How does metaphysics go wrong? Well, it goes wrong whenever there's the natural tendency to think that either space and time or the categories are not just ways that we as human beings happen to experience or order the world, but that it belongs to the way that the world is in itself. That is fundamentally the confusion that's at stake. Metaphysics generates illusions because it makes us feel like we can go beyond all of our possible experiences, right? We can go beyond the domain of what it is that appears to us into the ultimate nature of reality, right? And, Kant in the Critique of Pure Reason draws an important contrast here with Leibniz, right? Leibniz wants to understand the world as it is in itself, right? The way that God would see the world, right? To understand the world perfectly, how it is, right? But for Kant, we're restricted always to simply discussing the way that the world appears for us, right? And as a result, there are certain determinate boundaries that we can never cross, which is the realm of possible experience. Metaphysics, because it's about the nature of the whole world, which we could never experience, right? Or it's the nature of God, right? Or it's the nature of free will. None of these things do we have a direct, immediate awareness of, right? Or we can possibly experience. We can only infer that they exist because of how we maybe use the categories. For example, okay, here's one example of how the categories can make you fall into a transcendent use of reason. Okay, one of the categories is cause and effect, right? So what that means is that for any object that you experience, you can, start to give like a causal story for why it is where it is and the way it is, right? Something that might lead you to a metaphysical inquiry is like, okay, if in the same way that I can take an individual object and I can ask the question, okay, what is the cause of that, right? And this is a correct use of the categories, then I always have the ability to then sort of draw up my experience as a whole or as a totality and be like, what's that, right? What is the whole sequence of events? What is that all caused by? What caused the universe, right? And obviously this is the sort of question, metaphysical question, that makes people go, well, it's God, right? God created the world. God was the first cause of the world, right? And from there, from the metaphysician's point of view, okay, well, what is the difference between my use of the concept of causality as it applies to God and your use of causality as it applies to this book? And Kant's answer is, your use of the concept of causality is transcendent because it's not applied to an object that we experience, but it's instead applied to the nature of reality as a whole. Right? And it's used to transcend, to go over the boundaries of our possible experience. And so it is a transcendent use of reason, right? It produces illusions, right? So this is why metaphysics is the domain of illusion, right? It's because the categories sort of naturally incline us to want to expand our knowledge more and more and more, right? But that this eventually goes beyond the boundaries in which they're legitimate, which is our possible experience, right? And so, how is pure mathematics possible? Kant's answer, construction. In other words, the form of our sensibility, space and time. How is pure natural science possible? Kant's answer, the categories, the pure use of our understanding. And then finally, how does metaphysics go wrong, right? And ultimately, Kant's answer is the transcendent use of reason. It's when reason tries to use the concepts of the understanding beyond the condition of sensibility, beyond anything that we could possibly sense or experience or understand. And this is what produces illusion and deception, and why the early modern tradition is plagued by these disagreements that are completely interminable, right? Because for Kant, they've passed this determinate boundary of where we can actually resolve disputes, and instead have entered into the la land of illusion, right? And so the purpose of Kant's prolegomena to any future metaphysics is to say, okay, prolegomena, that's like a teacher's manual. So a teacher's manual for any future metaphysics. Kant says, if we're going to do metaphysics right in the future, then we need to figure out, what are we actually doing whenever we're trying to engage in metaphysical disputes? How can we even determine via principles if they're right or wrong or make any sense, right? And this is Kant's attempt to provide an answer. Is he wants to say, okay, well, the way that you do it is you talk about all the powers or capacities that we have as human beings, right? And for cognition, there's three: sensibility, understanding, reason. Then you talk about the principles that govern them, right? You can talk about space and time, you can talk about categories, right? And talk about ideas or transcendent uses of reason. And then you talk about, how all of those are governed and how they work together and how, we ultimately make sort of judgments about the world, right? And so Kant thinks that he's solved this problem by strictly delineating the boundaries of possible experience. Pure mathematics is possible because it constructs using space and time, which are forms of our possible experience. Pure natural science is possible because it uses the categories, which have legitimate application to the realm of our possible experience. And how does metaphysics go wrong? It transcends the realm of our possible experience. And so here, Kant thinks that he has closed the book, really closed the book on all of the metaphysical disputes that we have been talking about for the entirety of this semester. So I'm really interested to hear what y'all think. I'll continue to respond to everyone on the discussion forum on Learn. Y'all are asking very interesting, robust questions. If you have any, lingering doubts about Kant, I would really advise that you go through and you read that thread, just because I wrote a lot to try to explain some intricate details, and in some ways I explained more details than I did in this video. But nonetheless, I hope it was helpful and that y'all are having a great week.